Jack. Jack. Is Jack here? I don't see Jack. Jack B. Jack Borkman? I don't see him. Okay, Antoinette. There she is. Nashin. Nashin. Oh, okay, perfect. Nashin is here. Great. Marisol. I see her. Maria.
Here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Trin.
Here.
Here's Trin. Thank you. Caleb. Okay, I see Caleb. Jalen told me he may not be able to make it. Did he make it? Okay. Oh, Jack B. Jack B made it. Good. Okay. Who's next? Marissa. There she is. Kabir. Kabir make it. Kabir. I don't see Kabir. Kabir, last call. No? Okay. Michael Jennings. There he is. Ashley. You see Ashley. Mason. Mason. Mason, last call. Mason K. No? Okay. Brian, I see Brian. Mackenzie, there's Mackenzie. Thank you, Mackenzie. Amelia, I think I saw your name up there. Adriana. No. Adriana is a no. Okay. Who's next? Nick. I think I saw Nick. There's Nick. Crap, I gotta do this. That's better. Okay, so I got Nick. Adam, I think I saw Adam. There's Adam. Amelia. I think I saw Amelia's name. Emmy, right? I'm gonna say yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Carly. There's Carly. William. There's William. Okay. Thanks, William. And then Emily. There's Emily. Thank you. And Steven. I think I saw Steve. Steve, okay, that's Steve Wilson, right? Thanks. Okay, so that means that the people I don't have, last call, is Kabir. I don't see Kabir. Mason, who I don't see. And I don't see Adriana. Okay. Chat. Yep. Okay, very good. Okay, so let's get started. So does anybody, since we went last time, I went over the syllabus and expectations, blah, 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 blah. Did anybody have any follow-up questions, concerns, things you wanted to talk about, anything like that from what we did last time? And I mean specifically in terms of the structure of the class and things like that. Okay. Good?
Yeah, is there any way
Okay.
you could do a like quick summary of it? I unfortunately wasn't able to make it, or unless there's another place I can
So
find
go.
this information.
So I'll tell you. Go on Canvas
Okay,
and read the syllabus. And if you have questions, email me.
awesome.
I think it's super straightforward. Basically, the bottom line is that there are 6 problem sets and 2 data assignments and 3 exams. The dates of the problem sets are listed in Canvas as well as the data assignments. The exams are in person on the day that's listed. on the schedule. You just go anytime during that day to the WCC testing center and take the exam. So I think it's pretty straightforward, but I'm happy to clarify if you have any other questions.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. So let's get started. Okay. So today I want to finish up the what you can kind of think of as the vocabulary section. I mean, last time we talked about like what is economics, the study of how we make choices. Okay. We need to make choices because of scarcity. We all know that. And we need to make choices because of scarcity. And when we make choices, we have to think about trade-offs and opportunity costs, right? Trade-offs are a direct implication of scarcity. When you choose one thing, you give up something else. Okay. So when you choose to come here to class today, you gave up working or being at home doing nothing. Okay. That's a trade-off. Opportunity cost is what quantifies the value of what you gave up when you make a decision. So opportunity cost puts a numeric value. It doesn't have to be numeric. But if it's not numeric, then we kind of run out of things to do with it, because in economics we like things in numbers so that it's easy to compare, right? So we quantify what you give up, and that's the opportunity cost. Okay. Then I talked about, okay, how do we actually take those things into account? You do it with this thing called marginal analysis, which in essence is something we all kind of know intuitively, and that when you are choosing to do more of something, you always compare the additional benefits of that thing with the additional cost of that same thing. Again, that's why it's so nice having opportunity cost in terms of dollars, because we quantify the benefit in terms of dollars as well. So I think we talked about like the McChicken example last time. When I go to eat a McChicken, if I'm willing to pay $10 for it and it only costs me $2, then of course I'm going to consume it, right? The next one, if I'm only willing to pay 8, but it still costs 2, I'm going to consume that one. So I'm going to keep doing that process until the marginal benefit and the marginal cost are equal, at which point I will be maximizing that surplus thing, being the difference between total benefits and total cost. Okay. So that's what I did last time, which it's kind of vocabulary review. I mean, trade-offs and opportunity costs, I'm never gonna ask, and you'll see on the problem set, which I will open up the problem set today because you'll be able to do more of it today. But never on a problem set am I gonna like dwell on asking you to calculate an opportunity cost of decision. I more so go over those terms because they're important vocabulary for setting up the models that we're going to have later, okay, which we'll see when we get there. Marginal analysis as well, being something that we're going to see a lot more in this class, especially when it comes to a firm's decision of how to maximize profit and how to choose a number of units of labor to hire. Okay, so all of the stuff that I said last time is probably not going to show up explicitly on an exam, but it feeds into the broader concepts that you will see. Okay. So the last thing that I want to say in terms of review-ish stuff is in reminding you about what we mean by production and what we mean by efficiency. Production and efficiency. So these two ideas of production and efficiency are going to come back again and again and again, especially efficiency. So I want to remind you of what you hopefully did in macro, talking about these two things in the context of the production possibilities frontier, just to remind ourselves of the vocabulary around these things. Okay, so production, when I say production, I am talking about the what do I want to say? The act, I guess, of using resources to make goods and services, via some kind of production method, via a production method. Now, production method is a purposely vague term, but it can mean any kind of process that's used to make goods and services, like an assembly line or something. Okay. So the idea here is that when we engage in production, we are taking resources, okay, which are sometimes called, let me actually move this over just so I don't run out of space. We are taking resources, which are sometimes called factors of production. Okay. I like to stick to calling them resources just because I try my absolute best not to muddy language. Okay, so just keep in mind if you ever hear the word factors of production or just factors, it's referring to the same thing as resources. And here, when we talk about resources, we are talking about land, labor, capital, and the last resource being the ideas, the entrepreneurship. Okay. So resources are these things that are used to make goods and services. So a farmer uses land to grow crops, right? They use the actual farmer operating the machinery. The machinery is the capital, and then of course the farmer could also be the entrepreneur, or maybe they hire people and that serves as the labor, right? I think we all hopefully know what I mean when I'm talking about these resources here. And all of these collectively serve as inputs to the production process. So all of these things act as inputs. They enter into this vague thing that we call a production method. Okay. And out comes the things that an economy consumes, goods and services. Okay, so these are outputs. Okay, so this is what an economy does. They take a bunch of productive resources and combine them in some way to make stuff. That's the idea. Now, with this, what you probably talk about in macro is the fact that, yes, I deleted the last time's notes, but we know, because we're studying economics, that we have scarcity. So these resources here on the left-hand side are limited, right? We only have a limited amount of land, a limited amount of people, a limited amount of machines. And I mean, you could argue with me as to whether we have a limited amount of ideas, but I guess we definitely have a limited amount of land, labor, and capital. Okay. Which means we are only ever going to be able to get a limited amount of goods and services, right? That's obvious, but it's worth saying because the fact that we're only going to get a limited amounts of goods and services means that we have to choose which goods and services we're going to get. Okay, so the idea is that we have limited resources. We have limited resources. So we can only produce, it's really ugly, produce a limited amount of output. Limited output. Okay. Now, like I said, that means we have to choose. That's the whole point of economics. Okay. Therefore, we have to decide how to allocate resources to achieve the desired mix. To achieve the desired mix of goods and, I'll write it out, goods and services. Okay. In other words, when I say that, it sounds kind of fancy. We have to decide how to allocate resources to achieve the desired mix of goods and services. But really what I'm saying is we have to decide what stuff we're going to produce, right? And when we decide what stuff we're going to produce, that is going to determine how our resources should be allocated, right? We can only produce a limited amount of corn and cars, so we have to decide how much of each we're going to produce. If we want to produce a ton of cars, we have to allocate our resources to car production. If we want to produce a ton of corn, we have to get everybody into the fields and on tractors so we can make corn, right? I mean, like I said, this is all kind of just formalizing obvious things, right? But really, the reason that this is so obvious to you is because you already took macro, right? And this is kind of like the key idea of economics. Now, that's why one of the first models that you study is the production possibilities frontier, which perfectly encapsulates this idea of having to allocate resources between two different goods. Okay, so this concept is represented by a production possibilities frontier. Okay, or PPF. Production possibilities frontier. Okay. Now, just to kind of remind you guys of what a PPF looks like, let's see. Oops. So here's a PPF. Let's just say corn and cars for the hell of it. Okay. And a PPF is defined as being the combinations of two goods, right? So in this case, corn and cars, that you can produce if your resources are fully employed, meaning, for the lack of a better term, if they're working as hard as possible. Okay. So a PPF is defined as the combinations of two goods that can be produced if resources are fully employed. Okay, so in other words, there are no idle resources, right? I'm going to try not to dwell on this because really this is review, and the only reason I'm doing this again is to remind you of the two different kinds of efficiency that we have, okay, which we're going to see again and again. So I want that idea in the back of your head. But to do so, I'm just going to like redefine the PPF. PPF is the combination of two goods that can be produced if resources are fully employed. So you send your resources into production and they work as hard as possible. So there's no labor sitting around. There's no tractors collecting dust, and there's no land that's just sitting there. Everything is being used to its fullest extent. And then these are the combinations of goods that you can produce along this line here. Okay. Now, because of that, all points that are on or below a PPF, all points on or below a PPF are said to be attainable. Okay, meaning it is possible to produce that amount of the good. So, sorry, keep getting a call. Okay, all the points inside the PPF, like this, can be attained because this could be attained if my resources are working as hard as possible. So apparently, if I just lay some people off or put some tractors in the garage, I could also produce this, right? But also, this right here is attainable as long as everybody works hard as possible, right? So everything on or below a PPF is said to be attainable. Now, that means that all points outside the PPF are not attainable. All points outside the PPF are not attainable. Not attainable. Okay, so you could never produce right here. Why? Because this is what you can produce if your resources are working as hard as possible. So how could you get more of both corn and cars? Well, you'd have to have resources working harder than what is as hard as possible, right? Which, it's not possible to do that. Okay, so it's not attainable. All right. Now, the reason that this PPF model is the first thing you do is because it perfectly, like I said this already, but it perfectly represents the core ideas in economics being trade-offs and opportunity costs. Okay. Remember, a trade-off reflects the fact that when you make a choice to do one thing, you give up the opportunity to do something else. So here you can see that if you want to produce more corn, you have to give up some amount of cars, which makes sense because if everybody's working as hard as possible and you want more corn, you're going to have to take people away from making cars. Okay, so a PPF in that sense, the PPF represents the trade-off associated, associated with increasing production of a good. Production of a good. In this case, either corn or cars. Okay. Now, the trade-off is always that you have to give something up. The opportunity cost is, of course, the value of what you have to give up, right? So if you're looking at this graph here, let me move this because it's kind of distracting me. Maybe I'll put it up here. Okay. If you're producing right here, let's say that this is, just for the sake of argument, let's say this is 4 corn and 6 cars, right? If you want to produce the 5th unit of corn, say right here, then of course you are going to have to reduce the amount of cars that you're producing, right? Let's say that this is 4. Okay. So if you want this 5th unit of corn, you have to reduce the amount of cars you're producing. The opportunity cost is then going to reflect the value of what you have to give up. So in this case, if you want 1 more unit of corn, you have to give up 2 cars. So the opportunity cost of producing another unit of corn is 2 cars right here. Okay. Now, as you can see, that is the rise, which in this case is 2, over the run, which in this case is 1. So the slope of this line between these 2 points is -2, rise over run. And the absolute value of that slope being 2 represents the opportunity cost. Okay, so the absolute value of the slope of the PPF, the absolute value of the slope of the PPF is the opportunity cost uh, of producing the good on the horizontal axis. Okay. So of course, if you wanted the opportunity cost of producing cars, then you would just go the other way. Producing 2 cars requires that you sacrifice 1 unit of corn. So per car, it's 1/2 a unit of corn. So it would be 1 over the slope, right? But in any case, it would just be the reciprocal of it. Okay. But that's the idea. All right. Now, in this example here, I drew the PPF so that the opportunity cost is increasing. Can you see that? Because if you are going from, say, 3 to 4, now you're only going the shorter distance here. Oops. Let's say this is 7. Okay. Now, right here, if you want to produce the 4th unit of corn, you have to give up only 1 car. If you want to produce the 5th unit of corn, you have to give up 2 cars. So the bowed out PPF like this is showing what it looks like when opportunity costs are increasing, right? Now, as you hopefully remember, the PPF, while it's typically bowed out, that is only an implication of the nature of resources, okay? So if we had a PPF that was linear, okay, a linear PPF would reflect constant opportunity costs. Reflects constant opportunity costs, okay? Which is to say that as production of a good increases, the opportunity cost of producing that good remains constant. Okay. So that would basically look like just a linear line. Okay. So this is a linear PPF, and this reflects constant opportunity cost. So you can see that here because the slope of the PPF is constant. So if the slope of the PPF is the opportunity cost, here we have constant slope, so the opportunity cost is constant. Okay. Now, this constant opportunity cost thing, this arises only under the very special condition when resources are not specialized. Arises when resources are not specialized. That means that every resource in the economy is equally suited for the production of all goods. Now, of course, this is not realistic. In reality, our resources are specialized. We have some people who are good at working with cars, engineers, and some people like farmers who are good at making corn. Okay. And we have tractors that are good at making corn and bad at making cars. And we have, drill presses and things that shape aluminum and all that kind of stuff that are good at making cars but bad at making corn, right? So in reality, our resources are specialized, which makes it hard to think of a world where we might have a constant opportunity cost PPF, which is why most time when we draw PPFs, we draw them like this, okay, to reflect increasing opportunity costs. So the one that I drew up there, the more realistic, is a bowed out PPF. And a bowed out PPF reflects the law of increasing opportunity costs. the law of increasing opportunity cost. Okay. Which is to say, as the production of a good increases, so does the opportunity cost of producing that good. As production of a good increases, the OC of producing that good also increases, as you can see up here, right? As you produce more corn, the opportunity cost increases as well. Now, this is what gives you the normal shape of the PPF being bowed out, and this happens when resources are specialized. Rises when resources are specialized. Okay, meaning they will be suited to a specific kind of production, right? So you have some farmers who are good at making corn and some engineers who are good at making cars. All right. Now, the reason that that produces a bowed out PPF, if you look up here, right, you can see that if you're producing very little corn, then the opportunity cost of producing corn is going to be relatively low. Why? Because if you're producing, say, very little corn, say you're producing up here, then pretty much all of your resources are on the assembly line making cars. If you want to make 1 unit of corn, then you just take some farmers off the assembly line, put them onto tractors, and they're going to make a lot of corn, and they're going to give up very few cars because they weren't that good at making cars, right? But as you produce more and more corn, eventually you're going to run out of farmers to put onto tractors. You're going to have to start putting engineers on tractors. Engineers are not that good at making corn, so you're only going to get a little bit of corn, but they were very good at making cars, which means you're going to give up a lot of cars. Okay, so the idea is once you have specialized resources, then the opportunity cost is going to increase as you increase production of a good. Okay, so that's why you get a bowed out PPF. All right. Okay. Questions? I don't know. Oh crap! I haven't been monitoring the chat. Okay. Good. Hopefully this is mainly reviewish. So, good. Very nice. Okay. The reason that I'm introducing the PPF again is because I want to remind you of the different definitions of efficiency. Okay. Efficiency is going to be a very important concept in this class. We're going to come back to it a lot. And it's kind of a challenging concept because it's context dependent. So I want to make sure that we kind of get our heads wrapped around the notion of efficiency so that we can hit the ground running when we're doing the models later. Okay. So when we talk about efficiency, broadly we are referring, now efficiency is one of those words that if you ask 10 economists to define efficiency, I feel like this is an important. You know, sorry about my phone. I told my class this last semester, but I have so my phone number is a 734 area code. But there's a Chinese restaurant, and it's ironically kind of by my house, that has the exact same last 7 digits, but a 313 area code. So if you live in a 734 area code and you just read their sign, which doesn't have the area code, and then you dial the number, then it'll direct you to the 734 area code, and so I will get the call. So all day long, especially right now around dinner time, I'm inundated with calls. Actually, let's see. Well, no, but I get inundated with calls for people trying to order Chinese food. It's annoying because they don't look like spam calls. So, oh my goodness, this person keeps calling me. But yeah, so that kind of is a little bit annoying. Yeah, no, it's no good. But yeah. So sometimes I get random calls. It's a little bit annoying. Okay, efficiency. So the idea with efficiency is that, so you're saying there, very good. Here, I'll laugh to that too. Okay. Okay. What was I saying with efficiency? I was saying if you ask 10 economists to define efficiency, you're going to get 10 different answers. Okay. And that is because it's a very broad idea and it's very context dependent. Okay. The most general definition I can think of for efficiency is it is how well resources are used to produce goods and services, I guess. Okay. Now, that is a purposely vague and extremely broad definition, right? So that's why you need context to better refine what exactly that means, okay? So in the PPF model, we have two kind of notions of efficiency. The first being what we call productive efficiency, okay? Now, productive efficiency, generally speaking, means that you're producing things without waste. In the context of the PPF model, it means that resources in the economy are fully employed. Resources in the economy are fully employed. Okay? Now, if you remember, the PPF shows the combinations that you can achieve if resources are fully employed. So anywhere on the PPF means that your resources are fully employed, which means anywhere on the PPF is productively efficient. Producing on the PPF. Okay. Now, allocative efficiency is not just any old spot on the PPF. It is the spot on the PPF that society most prefers. Okay. Allocative efficiency means that resources are used to produce the mix of goods and services that society desires. Okay. So every spot on the PPF is productively efficient, but not every spot is allocatively efficient. Okay. Allocatively efficient means that you're producing at the right spot on the PPF. Producing, let me say, the right combination. The right combination on the PPF. Okay. So now here's the thing is like productive efficiency, you can look at a PPF and you can tell what points are all productively efficient. Anything on the PPF is productively efficient. Let me draw a new PPF down here. Actually, let me make that a little bit bigger. Okay. So let's say we have points A, B, and C. Okay. All of these points, A, B, and C, are productively efficient because they're all on the PPF. Productive efficiency in the PPF model is relatively easy to achieve. You just make all your resources work as hard as possible and you will be productively efficient. But it's not a guarantee that you're allocatively efficient. Allocatively efficient means you're producing the right combination. Now, of course, the word right combination implies that you cannot tell which point is allocatively efficient unless you had some more information. Okay, so without any further information, if I said which points on this PPF are productively efficient, you would say A, B, and C. Without any further information, if I said which points are allocatively efficient, you would say, I don't know, because you need more information, right? So suppose that this economy has a bunch of people who are allergic to corn. Is C allocatively efficient? No, because you're producing a ton of corn, right? So A would probably be an allocatively efficient point, right? If I said, there is a ton of people and they all ride their bikes to work, then you don't need cars, right? You see what I mean? So you need more information. But of course, there's always going to be some kind of subjective element as to assessing which point is allocatively efficient. But the point is you need more information. You need to figure out what does society actually prefer of these points. Okay, does that make sense? So these ideas of productive and allocative efficiency are going to come back time and make sure that it's clear now what they mean in the PPF model so that we have the context to build on these definitions when we talk about efficiency in a market or efficiency for a firm and things like that. Okay. All right. That's a pretty good review, right? Any questions? Nope. All right. Sweet. So hopefully that, if not rings a bell, is hopefully it's eerily familiar. All right, good. Okay, awesome. So that finishes our, I guess technically our first unit, which is really only supposed to take a day. But the next unit is, so in macro, you dive into all these concepts in a lot more detail. You'd spend a whole day on doing PPF, you would apply it, you would shift it, all that kind of stuff. I'm just redefining it so that we have the context to move forward. But this next unit, I'm going to do a full, deep dive exactly as I would have done in macro, because supply and demand is absolutely crucial to understanding all of the models we have moving forward. Now, in macro, the reason that you do supply and demand is because you need it to understand the aggregate supply and demand model. Okay. Having a model of a single market allows you to conceptualize the supply and demand model that's used for the economy as a whole, even though they're very different models. Okay. Now, here in micro, supply and demand is a micro idea, right? So the applications of this supply and demand model are going to be a lot more direct and explicit and very closely related to the single product case that we have here. Okay. So that's why I want to do another full deep dive into supply and demand, because it is without doubt, absolutely no denying the most important model in economics. Okay. So maybe I'll write that because it's so important that I have to say it. It is the most important model in economics. Most important model in economics. Okay. And what it does, which you all know, thankfully, is it explains the determination of price and quantity. Of price and quantity in a market. Okay. So in the market for iPhones, what's the price and quantity? In the market for corn, what's the price and quantity? In the market for lemonade, what's the price and quantity, right? It explains the determination of those two things. Okay. Now, a market, I won't dwell on the idea of markets, but roughly speaking, a market is any sort of institution that enables buyers and sellers to interact. Or maybe I'll just put it in more simpler terms, that brings buyers and sellers together. Buyers and sellers together. Okay. So the lemonade stand that your neighbor's little kid sets up is a market because it brings buyers of lemonade and sellers of lemonade together. Facebook Marketplace, it's in the name. It's a market. Buyers go there, sellers go there to transact and interact. Okay. New York Stock Exchange is a market, right? Going to a department store, it's a market in a sense, right? It's an institution where buyers and sellers interact with each other. Okay. That's the idea. Okay. So let's get into the meat here. Let's start by talking about demand. Demand. Okay. So the way that we define demand is by saying demand is the quantities of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at various prices. Okay, holding all other relevant factors constant. I know this is a big ass definition, but it's demand. It's one of the most important things. Okay, holding all other relevant factors constant. Okay, so in other words, as we talked about last time, ceteris paribus. Okay, so let's break that down. Demand is the quantities of a good or service, so of course we can be talking about a good or a service here, that consumers are willing and able to purchase. So when we talk about demand, you need both willingness and ability. You have to be willing, you have to want the good, and you have to actually be able to afford it. Do I want a Lamborghini? Absolutely. That'd be awesome, right? Would I be willing to pay 50 grand for a Lamborghini? Sure, I'd be willing. That's a pretty good deal. Am I able to pay it? Well, no, right? So you need both willingness and ability. And there are things, of course, that I'm able to purchase, but which I do not want, right? I don't know. Like my wife is obsessed with like water bottles, like the different kinds of water bottles you can get. Like, am I able to purchase a $40 water bottle? Absolutely, but I'm not willing to purchase it, right? So you need both willingness and ability for it to constitute demand. Okay. And then when we're talking about demand, we're talking about various prices, right? So we think about how much of the good or service would we buy at a bunch of different prices, okay, holding everything else constant. So change only the price and keep income, taste and preferences, the prices of other goods, the number of buyers, right? Expectations, keep all of those things constant. Change only the price and see how that affects the quantity of a good or service that people want to buy. Okay, that's demand. Now, the big deal with demand, the main law that governs the demand relationship is what we call the law of demand. Okay, which says, I mean, I keep saying this, but like economics kind of gets made fun of sometimes, at least in the early stages, because you say a lot of things. I mean, of course, as the price goes down, you want to buy more of the good. Okay, so ceteris paribus, as the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. Okay, that is the law of demand. Now, that is, of course, I should probably just, the colon is kind of weird there. Ceteris paribus. As the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So everything else constant, as the price goes down, you want to buy more of the good. Now that is obvious. Okay, what's probably less obvious is the two factors that kind of drive this relationship. So what explains the law of demand? Okay, two factors. The first is called the substitution effect. Substitution effect. Okay, which has a very precise mathematical definition. But in words, the substitution effect says that, look, as the price of a good falls, consumers buy more of this good and, well, I should say more of this good with a relatively lower price. Relatively lower price. And less of the goods with a relatively higher price. Okay, meaning when the price goes down, consumers substitute, right? If I want to buy apples and bananas and I just want some fruit, right? As the price goes down, now apples are now relatively less expensive than bananas. So I'm going to buy more apples and fewer bananas. I'm going to buy more of the good that now has a relatively lower price, and I'm going to buy less of the good that has a relatively higher price. Of course, yes, I know it's straightforward, but it's important to quantify these things. And then the second, maybe less obvious explanation of the law of demand is the income effect, which basically says, look, when the price of a good goes down for a fixed income, the buying power of your income has gone up, right? If I have $100 to spend at the store and apples are $2, I can buy 50 apples. If the price of apples falls to $1, my buying power of apples has gone up. I feel richer, so I buy more of the good. Okay, so as the price falls, the purchasing power of income, the purchasing power of income rises, so consumers buy more of the good. So consumers buy more of this good. Okay? So these two factors here explain the law of demand. As the price goes down, consumers substitute for that good, so quantity goes up, and consumers feel richer, so they buy more of that good. So quantity demanded goes up. So in any case, as the price falls, quantity demanded goes up. That is the essence of the law of demand. Okay? So that explains kind of the demand relationship. At these various prices, at the lower prices, consumers are going to be willing and able to purchase more goods. Okay? The way that we end up kind of visualizing this is with a demand curve. So the demand curve is a graphical representation of demand. A graphical representation of demand. Damn it. There. Okay. Now, you all know very well by now what a demand curve looks like. Let's draw one. So this will be quantity demanded, and this will be price. And then you have demand like that. Okay, there's a demand curve. There it is. Okay, now this demand curve is, of course, downward sloping. Why? Because of the law of demand. It is downward sloping to reflect the fact that as the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. That is exactly the law of demand, right? So if the price is sitting here at P1 and the quantity demanded is right here at QD1, then if the price were to fall right here to P2, then the quantity demanded would go up to QD2 right there. So as the price falls, quantity demanded goes up. Movement along the demand curve, like so. Okay. That's the law of demand. So it's really visualizing the law of demand. That's the idea. Okay. Now, importantly, a demand curve has kind of two interpretations when you look at it. Okay. Now, these two different interpretations will have value depending interpretations. These interpretations will have value depending on what you're doing with the demand curve. But the first interpretation is that you can think of it as being the willingness to pay for any quantity. Okay, so for the quantity of QD1, the most you're willing to pay for that unit is P1. So if P1, just for the sake of it, let's say that this is $10 and this is $5. Okay, then the most you're willing to pay for QD1 is $10. Okay, that's one way that you can interpret it. Now, here's what's important, and it's going to come back to us later on. If you remember, right, the willingness to pay is how we define the marginal benefit. Okay, which means that this demand curve is the same as the marginal benefit. Okay, that's going to be super important. Ironically, it's going to be important in like very late in the semester. Okay, but for now, put it in your notes and keep it in the back of your head. Recall that the willingness to pay is the marginal benefit. Now, hopefully that idea is not shocking to you, because last time I showed you that when we decide how many of a good we want to consume, we use marginal analysis. Okay, the marginal cost is the price. We're going to buy all of the units of the good for which the marginal benefit exceeds that price and stop when the marginal benefit is equal to that price. That's exactly what demand is representing. Okay, if this is the marginal benefit, then what this is saying is, are you going to buy this unit? Yeah, because the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. You'll buy this one because the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, this one, and then you're going to stop right here where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, which is the price, right? So it shouldn't be shocking that this demand curve is the marginal benefit, okay? But just keep that in mind for later on, okay? So that's one interpretation. The second interpretation of a demand curve is pretty much what most people think of it as being the quantity demanded for any price. Okay. For any price, it tells you how many units you want to buy. At the price of $10, you want to buy QD1 units. At a price of $5, you want to buy QD2 units, right? So you can interpret it in either of these two ways. Each of these interpretations will have value depending on what exactly you're doing with the demand curve, okay? All right, cool. Good so far? Any questions?
Good.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is the relationship between a market demand curve and an individual demand curve. Okay. So market demand curves are the result of adding individual demand curves. Market demand curves are the result of adding individual demand curves. Okay, so I need to do an example to kind of show you what's going on here. So say we have two consumers, Tom and Joe. Joe's quantity demanded. And let's say we have a bunch of different prices. You guys have no idea. Well, some of you do. How nice it is that I have this line drawer now. Wow, that looks so good. Okay, then I can go like this. Okay, so we have, oh, dang it. Well, let me see if I can just point eraser. Oh, nice. Okay, because I'm going to need some space over here to draw the graph of these things, which I want to do. Okay, so let's say that Tom's quantity demanded looks like this: 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. And Joe is looking at 0, 0, 0, 5, 10, 15. Okay, boom. Now let's graph each of these two demand curves. Nice. 4, 6, 8, 10. I don't like that scale. I want the scale to look a little better. That's all right. I'm never going to get it perfectly to scale. And by the way, neither are you. So I'm never going to like mark you down for not getting the scale perfect. Okay. It is what it is. We try our best. Okay. So let's start with Tom's demand curve. So maybe we'll do this in red. Okay. So at a price of 12, Tom doesn't want any. Okay. At a price of 10, he enters the market and buys 5. At a price of 8, he buys 10. Price of 6, he buys 15. Price of 4, he buys 20. Price of 2, he buys 25. Okay. I'm kind of nervous to put a line through this because I'm not going to put a line through it because it's not going to be, that doesn't look too bad, right? Yeah, let's just go with it. That looks good. Okay, so that's Tom's demand curve. Looks great. Thank you. Okay, and that's Tom's demand curve. Let's see here. What color should I use for maybe sky blue for Joe? Okay, so Joe is then at a price of 12, he buys 0. Price of 10, he still buys 0. Okay. Price of 8, he still buys 0. Price of 6, he enters the market with 5. And then a price of 4, he's going to buy 10. And then at a price of 2, he's going to buy 15. There we go. And I'll go like this. Okay, boom. So now maybe I should label these. This is Joe. Actually, I don't want to call it Joe. I want to call it demand Joe, like that. And then I'll call this one demand Tom, like that. Okay, so those are the individual demand curves, and they both look like individual demand curves. They're downward sloping to reflect the law of demand. As the price goes down, both consumers buy more of the good. Okay, now the market quantity demanded is obtained by adding up Tom's and Joe's quantity demanded at each price. So the price of 12, Tom wants 0, Joe wants 0, so the quantity demanded is 0. Price of 10, it's 5. Price of 8, it's 10, 20, 30, 40. Okay, so now when I graph this out, the price of 12, it's 0. Okay, price of 10, it's 5. So the same point is right there. Price of 8, it's 10. Same point is right there. Price of 6, it's going to come out to 20. Price of 4, it's 30. And then price of 2, oh, I don't know why I wrote 14. I should say 40. Okay, price of 2 is 40. So there's going to be kind of like two segments here. This segment and that one. This is the demand for the market. Okay. So you can see here that we derive the market demand curve by horizontally adding up these points. So at a price of 10, we add these 2 points. Price of 8, we add these 2 points, these 2 points, these 2 points, these 2 points. They get added up. That's why this process of constructing a market demand curve by adding individual demand curves is called horizontal summation. Okay. So you derive, let me see. Derive the market demand curve by adding individual demand curves, and that is called horizontal summation. Called horizontal summation. Okay. Now, hopefully you can see up here that for prices of $8 and above, so if you look at prices of $8 and above, the market demand curve is the same as Tom's demand curve. Okay, why? Because at prices of $8 and above, Tom is the only consumer in the market, right? At prices of 8 and above, as we can see here, Joe is not in the market at all. So at all those prices, Tom is the only participant in the market, which is why the market demand curve is the same as Tom's demand curve above those prices. Once you fall below a price of 8, then you can see that Tom, or who's it? A price below 8, Joe enters the market, and so the market demand curve becomes the sum of these two demand curves. Okay? All right. So that's how you obtain a market demand curve, by looking at each individual consumer's demand curve. Okay? All right. Last thing that I want to say really quickly about demand is that you can represent the demand curve with an equation, right? And this is where I want to kind of make this class a little bit more micro-y, right? Is in engaging a little bit more math in our analysis. So a demand curve can be represented as a function. Okay. So, for example, go ahead and try and draw the following demand curve. Draw the following demand curve. Okay. This is extremely important. So give yourself a second to try and draw this demand curve. Okay, so there is the quantity demanded at each price, right? Rather than representing this as a table like we sometimes do, or as a general graph like we might want to do, here we're going to be a lot more specific with it. So try and draw this demand curve. Okay. I'll give you a second, then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so here's how I do it. Okay, now let me be very clear. This is graphing a linear equation, so there's many ways that you could approach this or do it. Whatever way works for you is best. I never care about how you solve a problem as long as you get the right answer, okay? And as long as you have a process. So what I do here is I always rewrite the equation because when I see a plane like this, I want this in terms of y equals mx plus b, okay? And this is really the y and this is the x here. So I need to rearrange this equation. So when I take this equation, I would like to rewrite it. So I'm going to rewrite it by adding p over 2 to both sides, okay? And then subtracting qd from both sides. And then multiplying the whole thing by 2. And as a result, you're going to get that p equals 10 minus 2 qd. And now my brain can grasp that a lot easier because I can see, okay, if the quantity is 0, the price is going to be up here at 10. Okay, and if I plug in 0 for P, what am I going to get for Q? I'm going to get 5, which means that this is going to be 5 right here. So the demand curve, I guess that's fine, is going to look like this. Okay? How's that? Is that good? That's super important. Like, that, I mean, that's pretty much, it's just math. It's not really economics, but it's important to do that so that you can get a baseline for the analysis. Is that clear how I did that for everybody? Questions about it? Good? All
Good.
clear. All right, cool. By the way, like you're gonna have plenty of practice with this stuff in the problem set. So if there's ever something in the lecture that you're like, I'm not sure how we did that, or I need more practice with that, there's gonna be tons of practice in the problem set to see these things. Okay, but I like to show at least a couple examples. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is, of course, shifts in the demand curve. Because all that a demand curve tells us is how price affects quantity demanded. But obviously, price is not the only thing that affects how much of something you want to buy. Okay. And that is an extremely important idea. So when we talk about the determinants of demand, okay, we are talking about shifts of the demand curve. Okay, so factors other than the price, factors other than price affect quantity demanded. These are called determinants of demand. Called determinants of demand. Okay, the word determinant, I mean, it means something that determines something, which obviously, but like it in economics, it means something that shifts a curve. So a determinant of demand is something that shifts demand. Okay. Now, obviously, I'm going to list out what these things are, but you kind of see what I'm talking about here, right? The price of something is not the only thing that affects whether or not you want to buy it. Your income matters. Your tastes and preferences matter. The prices of other goods matter. Okay. So all of those things are going to shift demand because they're not price. So when these factors change, when these factors change, the entire demand curve shifts. The entire demand curve shifts. Okay. So what that looks like, let's draw a demand curve and show what these shifts look like. Price, quantity, demand, let's call this demand 0, is demand may shift to the right. Shift to the right. Now, when demand shifts to the right, that is an increase in demand. Okay, that's the term that we use to describe it, right? That is an increase in demand. And what it means is that at every price, there is now a higher quantity demanded. Higher quantity demand. So if demand shifts to the right, you would get this, demand 1. And you can see that at every single price on that axis, on the new demand curve D1, the quantity demanded is higher. Okay, so if we're looking, say, at this price right here, then you can see that on the new demand curve, QD0, just heard a weird noise. Okay, and then demand can also shift to the left. I wish I would have made that arrow not into the dotted line, but I think everybody gets the point. I think you all get what I'm trying to say here. Okay, which is that demand could shift to the left, shift to the left, which would reflect a decrease in demand. And that would mean that at every price, there is a lower quantity demanded. Okay? Hopefully you're all remembering the idea with that. Okay? So let's talk now about all the things that can shift demand. So determinants of demand. Determinants of demand. Okay, so the first thing that we have is taste and preferences. Now, taste, this is kind of a lame one because it's one of those things where it's kind of like you know when you see it. Okay, there's something that happens that makes consumers want to buy that good. I mean that's basically the idea. If there's a super popular show out and the main character is wearing a sweatshirt that everybody likes, then everybody goes to buy that sweatshirt. I mean, you see what I mean? It's kind of just like something happens that makes consumers want to buy that good. Okay. The thing that and this is like really easy for us to think of now because of like viral trends and stuff. Like the thing that always comes to my brain is like the feta cheese trend with the pasta during COVID. Does anybody, maybe nobody knows does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. You know. What's Nito, Tyler?
They're like little squishy like fidget toys that like
Oh,
people
okay.
are literally like hoarding them and like
Okay.
pushing people in stores.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me, yeah, you see it with like what is it, like the Labubus and things like that. Like, oh, so Pokemon cards. Yeah, I mean, something happens that makes people want it good. That's taste and preferences. So it's kind of lame as something to write here because it's kind of just something where you know when you see it. Taste for a good increase, then demand for that good is going to shift to the right. That's the idea. Okay. Pretty straightforward there. So I'm gonna try and like do 2 columns here. So I'm gonna not go over. I don't want to have to scroll. Okay. Second thing is related goods. Related goods. Now, related goods can fall into one of 2 categories. The first category is what are called substitutes. Substitutes are obviously goods that are used in place of one another. So what's a good example of a substitute? Substitute goods. Anything in the chat for a good substitute? Margarine and butter. Yeah, it's perfect. Greek yogurt and sour cream. That's super interesting you say that because I had no idea how identical they taste to each other until just recently. I think Greek yogurt's a lot better for you than sour cream. I think, maybe, I don't know. Like non-fat, it is. Yeah. So I had no idea, but if you put, Greek yogurt on something, it will taste exactly the same as sour cream. It's kind of insane. Jelly and jam, yep. So yeah, all those things are substitutes, okay? Xbox and PlayStation are substitutes, Gatorade and Powerade are substitutes, whatever. So if you go to the store and you see that sour cream has doubled in price, what are you going to do? You're going to buy more Greek yogurt, right? So if the price of a substitute rises, the demand for the good you're looking at goes up. Okay. Right. If you go to the store and you see the price of butter has tripled, you're going to buy more margarine, right? If you see that, like Nintendo Switch just raised the price of their consoles, right? I think they're $500 now. That might make people want to buy more PlayStations or Xboxes, whatever. I think you guys get what I'm trying to say here, okay? And then you have complements. Complements are goods that are used with each other. So what's a good example of that? Price of, oh boy. Maybe it's just not. Price. My OneNote is starting to lag a little bit. Price of complement goes up. Let's see. PB&J is the absolute classic. So for a lot of these examples, I like to call them like the canonical example because it is like the most classic example of that thing. We'll see this a lot through the semester, and it just becomes like a good gauge for like the best example of something. The classic canonical example of a complement is peanut butter and jelly. Hot dogs and hot dog buns is super close as well. So same thing with hamburgers and hamburger buns. Drum and drumstick, that's good. Camera and lenses, yeah, that's a good one. So does that mean a firm would use competitors as a determinant of demand? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. The firms, as so for now, don't try not to think about a firm's decision making right now. We're going to get to that later. But it depends on the nature of the firm, how they view the demand curve and how they view competitors. So we'll come back to that idea many, many times, William. Okay, so good. So of course, when the price of a complement goes up, demand goes down, right? Oh boy, my OneNote is starting to get kind of laggy. That's okay. So I think Tyler's a photographer or something. Like if the price of cameras went up, then he would buy fewer lenses, right? That's the idea, because he'd buy fewer cameras, okay? Can I please scroll up a little bit? Yeah, let me go like that. How's that? Okay. So those are related goods. Thank you. Good. I'm thinking that there was just a word you're missing, so I'm going to go back. Okay. So that is related goods. I think I was like this. Okay. 3 is income. Of course, income is a determinant of demand, but of course we have 2 kinds of goods here. Normal good and inferior good. Okay. A normal good is normal in the sense that when income rises, demand goes up. Okay. An inferior good is inferior in the sense that when income rises, demand goes down. So what's an example? What's some examples of these things, normal and inferior goods? Anybody? Inferior, great value. Yeah. I always think it's funny. I think it's funny asking people what are inferior goods. Because everybody has a little bit of a different opinion. Anything else? Yeah, so inferior goods are ramen noodles. I mean, that is an example of the canonical example. It's a classic example of an inferior good in that, there's a stereotype of like you're in college, you don't have much money, so you eat ramen noodles. You graduate, you stop eating ramen noodles. Inferior single ply toilet paper. Oh, that's funny. Spam. That's hilarious. Spam's a good one. Although, of course, you can see I'm not crying because I'm laughing. I'm crying because like it's super bright in my eyes. Although you can see that there's some level of actually by glass milk that's like thick and interesting, like whole milk on steroids. Yeah. So this is one of those things where it's subjective. right? Like what's an inferior good is subjective to the individual. You know, spam, I think my grandpa would eat spam even if he won the lottery. That man loves spam. So I'm never gonna like throw something on an exam and be like, suppose it's spam. What happens if demand goes up, if income goes up? I'm never gonna do that. I'm always gonna make it abundantly clear that I'm talking about a normal and inferior good. Suppose that we're talking about the market for spam, which is an inferior good, and income goes up. What happens? You know what I mean? Like there's a level of subjectivity here. That's whatever. Like we're gonna like me and my family, we're gonna get like the great value mac and cheese. That's like 99 cents from Walmart. We'll eat that even if we hit the lottery. We love that stuff. I love spam. Thrift clothing, that's a good one. I guess rich people buy glass milk. I never heard of glass milk. Did you mean to say glass or did you mean a different word?
No, it's straight up a glass. It's like they poke a hole in it and it really just pours out.
Interesting. Interesting. So the classic example of an inferior good is ramen noodles. The classic example of a normal good is steak. Okay, it's just one of those things that empirically we've seen that richer countries tend to eat a lot more meat, as hopefully it's kind of obvious. Okay, we only have two more of these, don't worry. Is the number of buyers. Buyers, number of. Okay, so obviously if there are more buyers in the market, then demand is going to go up. The number of buyers goes up, then so does demand. It's kind of obvious, right? Why is that obvious? Because when there are more buyers, there are more demand curves that you're adding up together. So this market demand curve would be further out. So that's demand shifting to the right. Okay. Last thing is expectations. Okay. If you expect the price of a good to go up in the future, so you expect the price to increase, or you expect there to be shortages, expect price to rise or there to be shortages, then that is going to increase your demand today, right? I mean, gas is a good example of this, right? If I told you, I mean, gas prices are already high, but if I told you the price of gas is going to double tonight at midnight, then when we all leave here at 8, you're going to go and get gas right now. Demand is going to go up. So of course, I can't really spoil the surprise to you because you all know this already, but of course that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because when demand goes up, the price goes up. So now, why did I write it in this order? Why did I write it like this? Because, of course, there's an acronym that I use to remember these things. TRIBE, tribe. Okay, tribe. So the shifters of demand are tribe. So I tell a lot of my classes this, but when I first learned economics, my instructor had a way of caring less about like the details and just about us memorizing stuff. And so we learned a ton of mnemonics for all of this stuff. So the mnemonic that I always had to remember is the tribe demands justice. Everybody has their own way of remembering these things. Tribe being tastes, related goods, income, buyers, and expectations. That's why I had to write buyers number of, because then it makes the acronym work. Okay, that's demand. Last thing I want to talk about with demand is something that it's a little annoying to talk about, but it's extremely important if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about. And that is the difference between demand and quantity demanded. Demand versus quantity demanded. Okay. So when we say quantity demanded, we are referring to the amount that consumers are willing and able to purchase. Willing and able to purchase at a particular price. At a particular price. Meaning we are talking about a single point on the demand curve. A point on the demand curve. Okay. It's the amount that consumers are willing and able to purchase at a particular price. So you look at a demand curve, pick a price, trace that to a quantity demanded. That is quantity demanded. So quantity demanded changes when the price of that product changes. Changes when the price of that changes. Okay. So this is a movement along the curve. This is a movement along the curve. It's tracing you along a given demand curve. Okay. Now, demand is the entire relationship. It is the relationship between the price and quantity demanded, which is to say it is the entire demand curve. The entire, oops, never done that before. Demand curve, okay. Now, demand changes when one of these determinants changes. That's what affects demand. Demand changes when one of the determinants of demand changes. When one of the determinants of demand changes. So income, tastes, number of buyers. Notice, none of those are the price of the product itself. The prices of related goods, yes, but not the price of the product itself. Okay, so when demand changes, this is a shift in the curve. This is a shift in the curve to the right, which would be an increase in demand, or left, which would be a decrease in demand. Okay. Okay. So this is one of those things where people talk about this in an annoying way, just so that language is consistent. Okay. Now I wrote all of that stuff and it probably seems pretty straightforward. Now, here is the main idea. I'm going to ask you a question, and this question, the answer will kind of tell me whether or not you understand, this idea. Suppose that we're talking about the demand for apples. Okay, like apples that you would eat, that you would pick at a farm or something. So the demand for apples. Suppose that the price of apples goes down. Okay, what happens to the demand for apples? I'm going to ask that again. Looking at the demand for apples, suppose that the price of apples goes down. What happens to the demand for apples? Let's see. Nothing. Okay, the answer is nothing. Nothing. Nada. Okay, so the idea here is that if we have a demand curve for apples like this, let's say this is the quantity of apples, and this is the price of apples. Okay, and then this is the demand for apples. Okay, when the price of apples goes down, say this is P0 and this is P1, it does nothing to demand. It just moves you along the demand curve. Do you see what I mean? So the price of apples goes down, quantity demanded of apples goes up. So I saw that, I'm looking at the chat here, and a couple people said increase. Okay, so when the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up, but demand, nothing changes. Okay, demand is the entire curve, the entire relationship. Does that make sense? Does everybody see what I mean? This is so important. Makes perfect sense. Okay, good. So this is extremely important. And the way that I always, now I think that hopefully, being that you guys have seen this before, it's like, all right, good. That's exactly what I was going to say, Maria. Like, seeing that now you've seen this again, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But explaining this to people in macro for the first time is an absolute nightmare. But something that I always say in macro, and I'll say it here, I'm going to say this a trillion times. If it's on the axis, it cannot shift the curve. Okay. If it's on the axis, it cannot shift the curve. If it's on the axis, it can't shift the curve. And if it happens to be on the axis, then it will not shift the curve. Okay. That is extremely important because the curve is what traces out the relationship between things on the axis. So if something on the axis changes, you use the curve to tell you what happens. You do not shift the curve. Okay. So if it's on the axis, it doesn't shift the curve. If you forget that, you're screwed. I'm just going to be completely honest with you. If you forget that, you're screwed. The price of apples cannot shift the demand for apples because it's what's on the axis. Now, where people's brains explodes is when I say, okay, the price of apples goes down. What happens to the demand for apples? Nothing. Okay, nothing. The quantity demanded goes up, but nothing happens to demand. If I said, suppose the price of bananas goes down, and let's say that bananas are like a substitute for apples, what happens to the demand for apples? If the price of bananas goes down and bananas are a substitute for apples, okay, then what's going to happen to the demand for apples? Good. It's going down. Yep. Good. Okay. So this is why people get confused, because the price of apples cannot affect the demand for apples. The price of bananas can affect the demand for apples. That seems extremely weird, but it's just a matter of if it's on the axis, it cannot shift the curve. The price of bananas is not on the axis, so it can shift the curve. Okay. Because exactly, William. Okay, bananas are a substitute, so it affects apples by making their demand go down. Right. So if the price of bananas goes down, then people are going to buy more bananas and they are going to buy less apples. So the demand for apples is going to go down because substitutes are exactly. So you guys are good. Okay. Does that idea make sense? Like when you can hopefully appreciate the fact that when I write this down for someone in macro seeing this for the first time, it's like their brain just falls out of their ear. It's like it makes no sense that the price of bananas can affect the demand for apples, but not the price of apples itself. Okay. But let me just be very clear about something. It's not necessarily the case that everything that's not on the axis affects the demand for apples. Everybody gets that, right? Like the price of a good that's completely unrelated to apples is not going to affect the demand for apples. Okay, it has to be a related good. So the price of, I don't know, I'm looking around random stuff in my basement here. So the price of coffee table, is that going to affect the demand for apples? No, because it's not really a substitute or a complement. I mean, again, you can argue with me and say it's a complement because you would eat the apple at the coffee table, but you get what I'm saying, right? Not everything off the axis shifts the demand curve. It has to be one of those determinants. Okay, good. How's that? Is that good? Okay, let's talk about supply. So supply is, of course, the other side of the market. Supply is the quantities of a good or service. A good or service that firms, I don't want to say firms. I actually don't want to say firms there. I want to say producers. Of course, I don't want to say firms because some supply curves are not representing firms. They're representing individuals. For example, individuals supply labor in a labor market. That producers are willing and able. So again, you need both willingness and ability to offer for sale to offer for sale at various prices. At various prices, holding all other relevant factors constant. Holding all other relevant factors constant. Okay, so in other words, ceteris paribus. Okay. All right. So just like we have a law of demand, we have a law of supply. The law of supply, which says basically that supply is upward slope. Okay. Spoiler alert. I think we all saw that coming. Ceteris paribus. So all else equal, as the price goes up, quantity supplied does too. Okay. And of course, that's vice versa as well. Did I say that? Up here, I think this was clear, but oh, well, you guys got it with the banana example. These are all vice versa. Right, you got it with the banana example. I said the price of bananas falls, so demand would go down. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that's the law of supply. Now, the law of supply, what explains that? What explains the law of supply other than just the obviousness of it? Okay, what explains the law of supply? So actually, we're going to talk about this law of supply thing a lot when we study firm behavior later in the semester. But for now, it will suffice to say that what explains the law of supply is this phenomenon called increasing marginal costs. Increasing marginal costs. Okay. For an individual, the marginal cost is the additional cost that's incurred when you buy one more unit of the good. For a firm, the marginal cost is the additional cost you incur when you produce one more unit of a good. So if you produce one more McChicken, how much labor cost does that take, materials, all that kind of stuff that gets baked into the cost of that McChicken, okay? One thing that is fact is that marginal cost. The first McChicken is going to cost a lot less to make than the 20th McChicken is going to cost to make in terms of like that next unit, okay? And this happens, okay? Marginal costs are increasing, okay, because marginal product, I know I'm throwing a lot of words at you here, is decreasing. Okay, this statement that I just wrote is extremely loaded. And we're going to spend an entire day talking about just that statement later in the semester. But for now, the basic idea is this. Think about McDonald's, okay? They have a fixed building and a fixed number of fryers and cashiers, right? When you add the first worker into that McDonald's, they can do a lot. There's a lot of machines for them to work with. You add the second worker, they can do even more, right? Because one can specialize on the fryer, the other can specialize on the cash register. What happens when you add the third worker? Suddenly, as you add more workers, they run out of meaningful tasks that they can accomplish. Okay, so eventually when you add the fifth or sixth worker, they're not really adding many McChickens to that operation. They might just be sweeping up or like helping out in some way. Okay, that means that as you add McChickens, okay, it's going to eventually take more and more labor than previous McChickens because each next unit of labor is kind of like worse than the one before it. Okay, that's to say the first unit of labor adds a lot of McChickens. The fifth unit of labor adds very few. Okay, so as you want more and more McChickens, it's going to end up costing more for each one because those workers aren't adding as many. Hopefully you kind of see what I mean. I know I'm being a little bit hand wavy right now, but eventually I'm going to dig into this a lot deeper. But for now, the idea is marginal product is decreasing, meaning each additional amount of McChickens added by the next unit of labor is decreasing, which means that marginal costs are increasing. Okay, now, because marginal costs are increasing, firms are going to produce output. Firms produce, so McDonald's will produce a McChicken so long as the price that they get for the McChicken exceeds the marginal cost. If the next McChicken costs $1 to make, then they're going to sell it as long as the price exceeds that cost, which means eventually, because marginal costs are increasing, for a given price, eventually you're going to run out of profitable units to produce. Okay, if the price is say $3 for a McChicken, eventually McChickens that cost $3.50 to produce, you're not going to make them. They're not profitable to produce anymore. When would they be profitable to produce? If the price went up. Okay. Thus, when the price rises, it is profitable for units. How's that? A little bit hand wavy, but I promise you, we're going to dive very deep into that later. But I think that kind of makes a little bit of sense, right? For now. Hopefully. Yep, that's exactly it, Tyler. You're gonna see that. You're gonna see exactly that. I mean, if you think about shooting a wedding, right? Maybe you have a camera and somebody around who can help a little bit. But yeah, as you add 5 videographers, that 5th videographer is doing nothing except getting in the way, right? But that videographer is going to cost something. Okay, so when you go to shoot a really big wedding and you need a lot of videographers, that last videographer isn't really adding that much. And so it means the cost of shooting that larger wedding is a lot higher. Okay. I mean, that's a really good example. We'll come back to this idea. But yeah, you're exactly right. Okay, so that's the law of supply. Now, the supply curve then is going to be a graphical representation of this relationship. The supply curve is a graphical representation. Of supply. Okay. And so let's draw it. There's a supply curve. At this price, let's say P0, we'll supply QS0. At this price, P1, we will supply QS1, like that, okay? So there's a supply curve. Okay, so the supply curve, as you can see, is obviously upward sloping to reflect the law of supply. Okay, as the price goes up, so does quantity supplied. That is the law of supply. Oh, I got something in the chat, didn't see. So like the bank scene. That's a good example. I always think of that scene when I think of like bank reserves, and I explain bank reserves for the first time in macro, and I say think of bank reserves like in the Dark Knight, or there's just a ton of money sitting in the bank vault. Yeah, good example. So upward sloping, as the price goes up, quantity supply goes up, so that's the law of supply. And just like a demand curve, this has 2 interpretations, okay? Both of which are valuable depending on the exact context that you're in. The first is you can think of this as the willingness to sell. So analogous to the willingness to pay is the willingness to sell, sometimes called the willingness to accept for a given quantity. Okay, so willingness to pay is the most you're willing to pay for something. So if you're willing to pay, $1,000 for an iPhone, that would be your willingness to pay, WTP, right? Willingness to sell is affirms the least that they would accept for it. That's why it's sometimes called the willingness to accept. So it's the minimum price that they would sell it for, okay? So if you look at QS0 here, let's say that this is, 10 units, and this is, $2. $2. Tiny little, let me clear that up, make that look better. Okay, there we go. So basically the supply curve could be interpreted as saying the least that the firm would sell the 10th unit for is $2. That's the minimum that they would sell it for. That's the willingness to sell or willingness to accept. Sometimes it's called that. Okay. Now you can also think of this in the more classic way as being the quantity supplied for any price. Okay. So both are valuable. Okay. Good. Now, last thing to say is that just like a demand curve, you can represent the supply curve with math. So the supply curve can be represented with as a function. Let me say that. As a function. So for example, draw the following supply curve. Quantity supplied is the price divided by 2 minus 1. Okay, give yourself a second, try and draw that. Hopefully after I drew the demand curve earlier, it makes it a little bit easier on you. But give it a second, try it out. And we're wrapping up here shortly, okay? Is it a question in the chat? Oh yeah, I can scroll up a little. How's that, Emmy? Is that better? Yep, no problem. Okay. So let's see how we draw this supply curve here. Now, just like with demand, when I see an equation like this, the first thing that comes to my brain is I want this in like y equals mx plus b. I want p isolated on the left-hand side. It just makes it easier for my brain to digest it. Do you need to do that? No, but it helps me. Okay, so I would rewrite this by, let's see, how do I want to do this? I guess I could do this. Let me just add 1 to both sides. Okay, so you can say qs plus 1 is equal to p over 2, like that. So that means that p over 2 equals qs plus 1. Okay, and then you just multiply both sides by 2. So you get p equals 2 qs plus 2. And now it looks exactly like a normal linear equation. So I can put a 2 here, and then that's where it's going to start at. So supply. At, say, 5, this is going to be up here at 12. Okay. We'll call it there. I'll stay after, answer any questions, but I'm not going to say anything new. Next time I'll do the determinants of supply. So on Tuesday, I mean, I'll do the determinants of supply, what shifts the supply curve, things like that. And then I'll talk about putting all this together into a market. Okay. So how's that for the day? Good? Yeah, I can scroll up. Good. I'll post the problem set probably today, even though you won't be able to do much. Yeah, you bet, William. Glad to hear. Glad to hear it went good. So Kabir never made it, Mason never made it, and Adriana never made it, right? Oh, Kabir. Kabir made it. I don't see Adriana, I don't see Mason. Kabir, I got you though. Thanks, Jillian. I don't have anything else to say unless anybody has any questions or wants me to scroll up, show you some notes again, anything. Would you mind scrolling back through the notes once more just to make sure I got it all? Sure. I'll start at the top and I'll go kind of slow. Just call me out if you need me to stop, okay? Let me zoom in a little bit more. Trin, I'll answer your question out loud. No, it won't be full notes. It'll be something akin to a half sheet of paper with notes. So you guys are gonna see, those of you who had me in macro, I don't know how many of you are still on here, know that the exams, there are no surprises on the exams at all. There are zero surprises. I make it a point to tell you very explicitly the exact kind of questions I'm going to ask you, because I kind of live by the philosophy that I want to see you execute. Okay, I don't want you to be surprised. So the notes are there to, not be a saving grace, but more so be something that you can use as confidence. Yeah, is that good, Antoinette? Anything else? Sounds like you got everything. Okay, good. Thanks, Trin.